from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome back to STRAT, and it's been a fascinating week that has taken place. This week, things are kicking off in a major way, and I'm going to cover a couple of big issues, one of which I find fascinating. And in fact, it just kind of broke Monday, March 24th, and the reverberations of this are going to keep going on and on and on. But I'm going to go into that, and then I'm going to cover something else. I got a lot to go through on this, but what I find is less about what the headlines have right now and more about some of the substance of what was within them, some of the things that were revealed. And of course, with that, they haven't really coined a term for it. I could call it the Signal scandal or the Signal app scandal or something like that, but it's just amazing. Basically, top Trump officials, to include Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Vice President J.D. Vance, and kind of the ringleader of this was Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, basically set up a Signal app chat group, it was what's being reported. And in there, they started talking about basically details of what we saw this last week with this highly sensitive, targeting details, policy discussion details of going after the Houthis, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And somehow they inadvertently added Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. And so on Monday, March 24th, he wrote this thing, which basically was saying that they texted him their war plans, which may be a bit of an overstatement, but not much of an overstatement. It's fascinating. And what's even more fascinating is that neither Mike Waltz or the White House has come back with a clearly strong denial that they use this commercial Signal app to discuss national security matters, military strikes. And I can tell you, as someone who has spent a bit of time, to use the colloquial term, downrange, unquote. I forgot to quote that first, but where you're downrange, you're doing very sensitive missions. There's targeting missions, all sorts of stuff going on. The idea that senior policymakers in Washington, D.C. would be using a vulnerable commercial app to discuss these things is, to me, stunning. Particularly as there's reports that even though Signal it's commercial grade encryption, widely considered much more secure than, say, WhatsApp, which is the most widely used, I think, app of that type worldwide. Even with that said, there is a feeling that foreign countries have penetrated Signal communications, Signal texting before, if you will, and that they can get in there and see what's going on. So it's just, to me, it's stunning. And then, of course, the mistake of adding the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic into the chat group, when you're talking to, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, the National Security Advisor, other presidential advisors, all these very senior leaders in the Trump administration is just, frankly, I just can't get it. Now, there are ways that this communication can happen. I mean, that's been going on. One way is you meet in a room somewhere and you discuss these things. Obviously, this is a huge breach by any term of operational communication security, certainly breach of security norms across the board, not to mention rules and regulations that are tied to how you discuss these matters. Now, there is an issue. These are very senior leaders with the power to declassify certain things. So one could say that when they were talking about this, they could have implicitly meant that because they were talking about it in an unclassified setting, that they had made the decision to declassify whatever it was that they were discussing. I see nothing to say that they did that intentionally, whether it was something that was assumed or implied, that's to be worked out. But it's just, you don't discuss sensitive issues of this nature, when you're putting certainly U.S. troops and U.S. forces in harm's way, it's just really unusual, to say the least, and very concerning. Now, beyond the fact that they were talking about strike missions to include the approximate time, locations of where these strike missions were when they were going to happen, where they're going to happen in Yemen, which, if that had been, for example, if the Iranians had intercepted that, they could have passed that right on to the Houthis, and potentially the Houthis could have employed some sort of air defense weapons to take out our aircraft and air crews. I mean, the thought of what could have happened is certainly frightening, to say the least. That did not happen, but beyond that operational security problem involved is it really does, based on what was relayed in the Atlantic, it really does provide some insight into what the thinking is of senior administration officials, not just on the planning for Yemen, but also very much how they perceive the Europeans, and perhaps a little bit on how they perceive the rest of the world. And I find that very fascinating, to say the least. In fact, I think that may be more revealing of this thing than the actual breach, if you will, of the attacks on Yemen. It was in a report, it talks about Vice President Vance, who noted the vast difference in shipping that goes through that area. Now, just a little background: Yemen sits at the, right there on the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, the strategic Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which goes into the Red Sea. And of course, the big issue there is just the sheer amount of commerce that goes through the Suez Canal. Of course, this is one of the most strategic waterways, if not the most strategic waterway of its type on the planet. It's certainly the busiest waterway of its type on the planet. And they were talking about, certainly, global commerce. This is very dependent, but they were talking about where this stuff goes. And they said, well, it's only about 3 or 4%, about 3% of the commerce goes to the U.S., but they were talking about how the Europeans is closer to 30 or 40% going to Europe. And I find that interesting that in this discussion, certainly, the vice president had brought that up as something to think about. And that immediately went into here the U.S., using a carrier task force. And as of recent reporting, that's going to be 2 carrier task forces out there going after Yemen, going after the Houthis in Yemen to stop their anti-shipping activities, piracy, using drones, missiles to take out commercial ships from around the world into that area. The thinking was, and the recognition within their discussion that the U.S. is the only country on the planet that can do something like this. So we're the only ones with the capability to do something like this. But the fascinating thing is, looking at the Europeans saying, hey, look, this is once again, the U.S. is expending blood and treasure, if you will, and hopefully not any blood, but certainly, a lot of treasure in protecting a vital sea lane that disproportionately supports Europe and the European Union. That to me was kind of a fascinating way of looking at it. And it does kind of show a little bit of insight, or a lot of insight, of how the U.S. does things on a global level in terms of global security that disproportionately supports the Europeans and European economic interests, and not so much U.S. interests. And I think one could say that, certainly on 9/11, when we went into Afghanistan, that was supporting U.S. interests in going after, Al-Qaeda, if you will, Osama bin Laden and the cadre of leadership around Al-Qaeda. But with that said, if you look at the map, you go, what is the vital U.S. interests in Afghanistan? What is the critical, after certainly a first few years, the question would be, what was our vital national interest? And we redefined it in many ways to talk about nation building and, the importance of girls going to schools and women participating in the political process and all sorts of things that I would say this administration wouldn't consider particularly vital to our national security interests or our national interests. So that was kind of an interesting thing that I saw going on kind of something that sort of in backdrop. It wasn't brought up in that discussion per se, but that's just something to kind of think in the back. It was very clear that they see European countries as kind of, dare I use the term, long-term freeloaders, if you will, that abuse the unique military protections that the U.S. can afford for securing essentially European economic interests, which is that vital Suez Canal, which brings in a disproportionately large amount of commerce into Europe. This follows some other things that have certainly sort of indicated this thought. The U.S. pulling out of NATO exercises, that's huge. In fact, the idea that you're having a major NATO exercise without the U.S. is just stunning to me. Also, the discussion that essentially the commander of NATO, the supreme headquarters, if you will, shape, the supreme commander of NATO would not be an American. As that's the first time that's happened. That's an enormous shift for that to take place, and a big statement that the U.S. is pulling back from Europe, well beyond the statements made by Secretary Hegseth and Vice President Vance in Europe some weeks back. And also, of course, President Trump and others have talked about not defending NATO countries who don't adequately invest in their own military requirements. And that goes back a ways. That's something that goes back to the first Trump administration. Back in the first Trump administration, the U.S. is spending close to 3% of its GDP, gross domestic product, on military. And it has been said by the Trump administration that we are protected by two oceans that keep us away from these various threats in Asia, like China, and various threats in Europe, like Russia. And so we're expending a phenomenal amount of our GDP on military stuff to literally protect the world, to protect the world's waterways and other things. And then Europe, historically, has been setting European nations who benefit from this, have been investing somewhere between 1 to 1.5% of their GDP, about half of what we put in. And they're literally on the front lines. And if you look at certainly Poland, now Poland's, they're putting a lot of money into national defense stuff. So they have really stepped it up. They're going to get to 5% faster than anybody else. And that's the Trump administration's current benchmark that they said. The first term, they said 2%. Now they're saying 5% of GDP investment for European countries. The Baltic states certainly are putting in something like this. But then you look at countries like the United Kingdom, France, Germany. These are much bigger countries. Germany's putting a phenomenal amount of investment in. All of Europe has declared that they're putting in a tremendous amount, about $840 billion in investment into this. But you have other countries, certainly Italy's not putting much in. I think Spain is like somewhere hovering above 1%. So there's other countries that just clearly are not pulling their weight, yet they benefit tremendously from the security and protection that the U.S. military affords all these European countries under NATO. So the feeling that was discussed within that Signal app group is essentially that the U.S. is footing the bill and they're not getting consideration from it. And for some of us who are, strong pro-democracy, free trade, if you will, over the decades, promoting democracy worldwide. If you look within the NATO Charter, it promotes democracy and democratic values, and that's with a little d, if you will, throughout Europe. That this very transactional sort of discussion may rub some people the wrong way, but it was very interesting to hear that discussion happening. Here's some interesting statistics. As you know, President Trump has been rather strong about his language concerning Canada, has talked about Canada becoming the 51st state. That's pretty darn strong. Canada, of course, is taking this, rather strongly as well. To say they're irritated would be a bit of an understatement, to say the least. And also, huge tariffs have been placed on Canadian goods. But I would point out that in 2014, Canada was spending about 1% of its GDP on defense. By 2017, that got up to about 1.44%. And then by 2000, it dropped back down to 1.38%. Now, if you look at the Arctic, which has become an area of great global competition, where the U.S. is dealing with the interests of Russia and the interests of China, very much trying to dominate what is a resource-rich Arctic area. When you look at that, you say, well, if you're on the Arctic, you need to be putting in a lot more money into your defense. And frankly, Canada has not been doing that. Canada's, in fact, I know a number of Canadians with veterans, military, that have said for many years that Canada has just literally let its military go, if you will. They have not been putting the investment in that they need to put in. So there is a legitimate beef there that the U.S. is essentially defending Canada, defending Canadian national sovereign integrity, if you will, or defending Canadian interests, certainly in the Arctic. And if you look at what's going on with those other countries, and I would include Denmark, which, even though Greenland is an autonomous, self-governing territory, under Denmark, it is still under Denmark. It's still Danish territory. It's a huge chunk of territory that Greenland has, very resource rich. And again, when you get down to brass tacks, so to speak, it's the U.S. that truly defends Greenland. It's not Denmark. Denmark doesn't have the military means to do so and has not been making the investment in its military necessary to defend, certainly some would say, its interests in the Baltic and in Europe, let alone being able to defend the interests of Greenland and the sovereign interests of Greenland, certainly in the Arctic domain. So one can make that argument, all right? Now, that's clearly sort of implied with the tone within that Signal app discussion. They don't talk about Greenland in there. They don't talk specifically about the Baltic or, the front lines of Europe and stuff. What they clearly talk about, though, is that Europe has not been pulling its weight, and that when the U.S. goes out there, kind of a switch in policy, that when the U.S. goes out there and expends treasure, if not blood, defending these global interests that disproportionately affect Europe, that Europe should be providing some sort of consideration to the U.S. All right, this is a fundamental shift in U.S. position. Maybe not a fundamental shift from the first Trump administration, I should say. The U.S. has a desire, as I mentioned, for free trade. Historically, we've had a desire for spreading democracy around the world. If you remember the end of the Cold War and throughout the 90s, this was pretty much a byline of whatever the U.S. was doing going into the mid-O's. But I think what you're seeing is, they're looking at the U.S. and like other great empires. I would mention the British Empire. I would mention the Roman Empire. They expend this phenomenal amount of money securing the empire, if you will. And at some point, they had to pull back. Romans most famously pulled back from Hadrian's Wall and pulled out of Britain altogether after being there for centuries. The British pulled back worldwide, pulling out of Hong Kong, India, its African territories, all over the world. The British Empire basically disappeared in the 20th century. And all of that was based on the fact that they simply couldn't afford to do that. Now, the U.S. has a budget deficit that's approaching $2 trillion a year. Not all that is defense, but we spend more on defense, I think, than I forget how many other countries combined. The next group of countries combined does just a phenomenal amount on defense. And so therefore, when you look at how much the U.S. is spending on defense matters, and they want to cut back across, the Trump administration wants to cut back across the board in government federal expenditures, you kind of see the same economic dynamic that you see with these empires of old. The British Empire, certainly, and what it experienced in the 20th century, and the Roman Empire, what it experienced in the 4th and 5th centuries. You definitely see that same sort of dynamic. So whether you agree or disagree with what the Trump administration is doing, I find the Signal app discussions to be fascinating just because of what they reveal. And I just think that, to me, is something to consider as more comes out on this, and I'm sure more will come out, although I thought that the Atlantic piece on this was very explanatory. I think there'll be more that comes out, but it was very revealing in the thought, and I thought I'd just kind of dive into this and sort of go into the philosophy, if you will, the thinking that this Signal app discussion sort of revealed amongst senior Trump administration officials, and try to do it in a way, there will be enough folks out there that will swing hard for whatever the Trump administration is saying, and there are a number of people who will swing hard against whatever the Trump administration is saying. I'm just trying to put some context in this to recognize why there is thinking like that and what is some of the backdrop on that. Now, also going on this week, and I think it's a big one, is the ceasefire talks in Saudi Arabia. This follows a series of things some weeks back. You may remember that Secretary of State Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz met with their counterparts in Saudi Arabia, and their Russian counterparts, I should say, in Saudi Arabia. A lot of discussion, and if you want to go back, you probably remember that famous Oval Office meeting involving President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine that just went completely south, that caused a temporary interruption of U.S. intelligence sharing with Ukraine to include a cessation of military aid going to Ukraine for a period of time. So that was kind of the backdrop of all this. But the U.S. and certainly President Trump seems dedicated to striking some sort of deal to stop the fighting. What's very frustrating to many, and I would say myself included, is when I hear that President Trump or Trump administration officials say things which I know are Russian Kremlin talking points. That's where they came from. For example, that the Russians have encircled the Ukrainians in Kursk. Never happened. The Ukrainians did pull back from Kursk, and that's a whole separate thing. That deals with the Russians were having a very difficult time employing drones because of electronic warfare capabilities the Ukrainians had. It took a while for the Ukrainians to develop these electronic warfare capabilities, so they started launching drones with fiber optic, very thin fiber optic cable connection, hardwire connection, that cannot be jammed. All right, that is a tactical battlefield innovation. I can tell you right now, you don't have to think too hard of ways that you could interfere with that tactical battlefield innovation. All you got to do is, in so many ways, cut the cord. And there's a lot of ways to cut a cord, and I do see more drone versus drone sort of thing, but I do see some ways that can be done. It's an innovation that is potentially easily countered, and I'll leave it at that in terms of how. And also, there's limits too. A drone with a fiber optic cable is a lot less maneuverable around a battlefield. Let's say, particularly if there's trees and other obstructions. If you go through trees and you got a fiber optic cable, the moment you start moving this way or that way, you're very likely going to get your cable all tangled up, and in which case you may actually bring down your own drone. The same thing is if you're going across a battlefield that's not pretty open, if you have undulating terrain and you try to mask the movement of the drone through the undulating terrain, once you drop down and come up, you may very well hook your cable behind you on something, and Murphy's Law of warfare will kick in, and you'll bring down your own drone or halt your own drone or do whatever it is. So, and of course, you could also have drones flying out there with very basic attachments, which could be designed simply to scoop in and hook up the fiber optic cables and cause problems that way. So anyway, that's what really caused the Kursk thing to happen. There is this discussion. There's a lot of stuff where they say the Russians are on the march. Look, the Russians have a phenomenal amount of resources. They got a lot of manpower, but they have got huge manpower problems. They have lost an enormous amount of tanks. As of this last week, they lost 900,000 troops. I want to say again, 900,000 troops in this war. And if they keep going at the same pace, if there is no ceasefire, by the end of June, they will have probably lost 1 million troops in this war. Now, I don't know at what point the Russian people say enough is enough. I will say that those who would normally step up and stop Putin have met with a series of unfortunate events, some of which involved mysteriously falling out of upper story windows in tall buildings. But at some point, enough will be enough. All right. Now, President Trump has had phone calls with President Putin, with President Zelensky. There's talk of further, this week they got the negotiations, sort of shuttle diplomacy. You got a Ukrainian group in one room, Russian group in the other room, and the U.S. are running back and forth. between the rooms with proposals, counter proposals, response to proposals, everything else that goes into something like that. The issue right now they're trying to get is a 30-day ceasefire. All right. They tried to get that put in place with energy infrastructure or energy and infrastructure or energy and civilian infrastructure, depending on which press release you read, which are not all the same thing. But it hasn't happened. All right. Now, there are problems. Putin's position, his minimalist goals are he wants to basically take sovereign control over the 5 oblasts, the provinces that he claims are Russian, which includes the 2 oblasts, which are called the Donbass, and then, of course, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea. What was a little disturbing was when Steve Witkoff, the primary presidential envoy for Ukraine, was talking about that, couldn't remember the names of the locations. And I'm like, okay, you're our U.S. envoy for this thing, and you can't even remember the 5 geographic names of the oblasts. I thought that was a bit of an oversight. Keep in mind, guy's got a lot on his mind, but he's also in real estate, and usually in real estate, you do remember, location. So I'm not quite sure why he couldn't do that, but it does make me a little nervous that he didn't. That's Putin's minimalist desire. His maximalist, of course, is just to take over Ukraine completely, and that he's never abandoned that. Meanwhile, obviously, Ukraine would like to recover all the terrain that the Russians have occupied, but that may be at one time, maybe in the summer of 2023, the thought would be that Ukraine could bust through the Russian lines, that the Russian lines would collapse, which at that point I think would have been likely if they had been able to bust through the lines, and maybe turn back the entire war. They didn't do it. And I think they missed a strategic opportunity. I could go into a whole other podcast on why I think they failed to accomplish that. But it's a big issue there. Anyway, they're trying to get this 30-day ceasefire put in place. As you recall, President Trump intervened to get the ceasefire put in place in Gaza. It happened, and no follow-on ceasefire was ever able to be put in place. So there was no peace deal after the immediate ceasefire agreement. I could see something like that happening here, where they put something in place. Of course, Russia's going to use it to rearm, re-equip, reposition, do everything to try and press the offensive forward. And unless they're crazy, Ukraine's going to try and do the same thing. And so it could very well turn into another thing. Anyway, that's a lot going on. To say that we are living, or we are experiencing the famous Chinese saying or Chinese curse that we live in interesting times would be to put it lightly. But I will say that maybe for the Trump administration, senior officials, they're kind of taking a different historic view. They see the success of the Marshall Plan. They see our huge investment in winning the Cold War. Part of that they'd see as the war in Vietnam. Definitely they would see the Korean War as part of that. And that it was time after these great successes that our allies overseas, that we helped rebuild, turn into economic powerhouses, that they start basically, as they would probably phrase it, carrying their own weight in terms of securing the international global security order, if you will. It's definitely a tough love approach, if you want to talk about that. But I do see something rather interesting going on there, and I think it ties directly to what the U.S. is thinking about with Ukraine over the long run as well. Anyway, much to think about, much to look at. With all that said, certainly go to stratpodcast.com for more about Strat, more about some of the other things I do. And then if you go to YouTube, you can go to Hal Kempfer TV. But and I do a lot of different media things that get posted. But if you go to stratpodcast.com, you can link into that other stuff right away. So thanks for listening to Strat, and hope that you listen to another one. And I should mention that on somewhere around April 5th, that Live Nation by Fox anchor Austin Westfall will be my guest, and I'll be interviewing him kind of like I interviewed Andrew Kraft, although we're going to touch on some things that we didn't get into in the discussion between Andrew and myself, and talk about a variety of topics. I think you'll find it fascinating. Austin has a very interesting background and a very interesting way of looking at this. He's also a big fan of the Strat podcast, if you've ever listened to our live segments. So with that said, hope to have you listen in next time, and thanks for listening to this one.